floating and available for support. Art's going to float and move around and support people in their individual projects that way, and so will I.
Also have grade.
So does everyone feel clear on that, on that actual pattern and structure? I'm very clear. This is like, I don't know what the hell's going to happen. Okay. Okay, great. It's good enough.
Steven, how are we doing?
So we got someone who's got access to the account, the back end of the account that I don't have, who's about to type.
So, actually, why don't we address some of the questions that, wait, we're on? You keep saying we're on.
Well, he says we're live. I'm waiting to see it actually on the screen itself, though.
She's seeing it.
It's working.
Okay.
We're live.
All right.
Hello, the internet.
Go ahead. There we go. Yes.
People are watching.
All right.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Why Holochain?
Why
Holochain?
Yeah, microphone.
Right.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the answer to this question is a little abstract, and it's going to mean nothing at first to you, but it's sort of, there's a deeper meaning for those of us behind the project as to why we're doing it. And it is to build an unenclosable carrier for social DNA. Right? Meaningless. Doesn't mean anything, right, to most people. We're going to have shared language about that. Oh, we have some people excited. Awesome. So there are power dynamics that get introduced into how we communicate and coordinate and collaborate by virtue of the mediums by which we can do that. Right? So right now, we are actually using a very ancient form of communication. I am pushing air through my vocal cords and shaking my mouth in different ways to make sound waves, right? And if Tim doesn't like what I'm saying, he can't grab the words out of the air and stop Mona from hearing them, right? This is a carrier that is unenclosable within a shared context. But outside the building right now, it is enclosed in this context, right? They're not hearing my words out on the street as they're driving by. So there's scope, there's still membranes for it, but within a shared context, it's unenclosable. And I would assert that part of why we look sometimes, we look somewhat nostalgically to ancient tribal wisdom for like equitable culture and that kind of thing, is in part because they operated on this kind of period. Everybody had equal footing, at least in terms of being able to vibrate sound waves. Like, you know, there were some people who may not have had that capacity, but most did. And that when you can create an unenclosable carrier, sorry. The problem with this carrier is that it's limited in scope, right? If you're not here when I'm saying it, except for this modern crazy internet streaming invention that we're recording, if you weren't there when something was said, then you missed it. And there's only so far you can shout to make sure that you're heard. So there's limitations in space and time. So we overcame some of those limitations by inventing writing, right? So if you paint something on the cave wall, you know, now it lasts. It endures over time, right? Or if we can write commands to our generals in the field and send via messenger to control our armies or whatever, right? We can cross space. You don't have to shout to the next country, right? And the problem with those, though, is that the carrier is enclosable, right? For the cave, I can stand at the entrance to the cave and stop you from getting in and seeing it, or charge you money, or that kind of thing. For the messenger, we can send people to intercept the messenger and stop it from reaching the the person in the field, or potentially change the message or whatever. Like once you've encoded it on a carrier like that, it's actually enclosable. That means there are places that are vulnerable to outside control. And all of the way that we organize on scale right now, including the internet, although the internet gives us tastes of different patterns, because parts of this have been delegated to less control. All of the patterns we have right now use enclosable carriers. So if you can control the broadcasting of the airways, you can control access to the ISP and have an internet kill switch. The government can seize a domain name and say you're doing illegal activity, and these types of things. They can block ranges of IP addresses and declare them unroutable because they were stolen, or there's a whole bunch of things that we can do. We think that we have a very decentralized architecture, but it still has many centralized points of failure. So all of that was to explain unenclosable carrier, which we packed into 2 words, right? To say that Holochain acts as an unenclosable pattern, a pick carrier. If 2 people want to play by a set of rules together, build an app, they want to coordinate in some particular way, there's pretty much no way that that can be stopped. There's still right now at this stage of internet architecture, weak points in being able to bring down internet architecture. But I'm thinking that those weak points will in the not too distant future be overcome, and we can only tackle some parts of this at once. But if you've got people running a distributed Twitter, for example, a peer-to-peer Twitter, and the government doesn't like that there's social movements that it's fomenting or whatever, they can't go and raid the data center with those things and shut them down, right? They would have to literally go into every home, kick in every door across every country, like with the crowdfunding campaign that we sold Holo ports, these little hosting boxes. These have been sold in, I think, 65, 68 countries now. Like when people have a little box that they're running as a host for other people, how do you go and shut all of that down, right? You can't. So that's the unenclosable part, and then the unenclosable carrier. The other part was social DNA.
Unenclosable carriers.
Thank you. The other part was social DNA. So, do you remember when cells were just cells? They weren't like multicellular complex life. I don't really remember that either. But with the advent of DNA, there was a whole explosion of new patterns of life, most of which sucked, most of which failed and died off, right? But a whole bunch of which survived and filled niches and found ways to interact and all of that. But the whole thing of being able to encode a coordinative capacity across different cells into this pattern such that each cell could take that set of instructions and then know how to be able to coordinate. Because notice, the cells in our body do not synchronize against some global ledger. They do not synchronize a blockchain. They carry a set of instructions and they embody their own state, and then they have protocols for interacting with the other cells that are also carrying the same set of instructions. And if you depart from those instructions, there's also some cells that come and beat you up and kick you out, and called the immune system, right? Like that's part of the functions as well. And basically, this is the strategy for the architecture of Holochain. And what we're suggesting is that when you have an unenclosable carrier that allows us to collaborate, communicate, coordinate on any scale, from 2 people to 2 billion people or whatever, that we will have an explosion of new social organisms. So, sorry, that's another word we don't have shared. Social organism is like all the corporations, institutions, governments, right? We think of ourselves as at the top of this sort of evolutionary ladder, but we don't realize that we are cells inside of another type of organism that we've created that has a different kind of intelligence, different from the intelligence of the individuals within it, right? If you get an enlightened CEO into an oil company and they decide that they're really committed to sustainability and they're gonna start foregoing short-term profit to take care of the planet, how long will that CEO remain CEO of that oil company? Right? There's a pattern of intelligence encoded into the corporation that has particular limits, and it's different than the pattern of intelligence of the individuals. They spawn offspring, they have self-preservation instincts, right? These are social organisms. These are ways that they're not a bad thing. They're just ways that we create to coordinate on different scales. We think that Holochain as an unenclosable carrier is going to create this same kind of Cambrian explosion that happened with multicellular life at the level of our capacity to organize and coordinate on scale, and hopefully be able to reverse some of the unhealthy effects of the patterns we're doing right now that are kind of cancerous and erosive and eating the planet. And so all of that, sorry, that was a big long thing, that's why Holochain. That's why we're building Holochain. Tom.
So how do you have an unenclosed carrier over the internet? Which is what I'm hearing is the ISPs can shut down site at any time. What prevents Holo from being in that same security experience?
Well, the ISPs can block your access. They can't shut down a site, especially not a peer-to-peer site. But yes, I was saying that the ISPs are the weak point in the chain today, but one of the things that you can do with these kinds of things, plug in a mesh network antenna to the USB port and start skipping over the ISPs and do your own mesh network. Holochain it's transport agnostic. We don't care whether we're using TCP/IP protocol, mesh networking protocols, next version of whatever. So yes, that's why I'm saying there are limitations right now. We can only tackle parts of this at a time, but I think that we will overcome that as well. That is a weak spot right now.
You have a follow-up question?
I'm not a statement, but
It looked like you had something.
yeah. So I'm curious of, and it seems like a big challenge in the same respect, but actually approaching it from the social context. Like we need to get to a place in society where anybody can have access to a button that presses that destroys everything from a philosophical point of view. So what type of healing needs to happen in the culture such that we don't have the people who are in the power, who are trying to abuse their position of power, who are trying to shut these things down? It feels like it's trying to circumvent it as opposed to actually addressing the social issue that it is.
I don't want to.
I say that question.
Yeah.
You can save it for later if you want to.
Yeah, can you write that one down actually so we have light?
Give me that question.
How do we change the social power patterns instead of just bypass them? The really short answer is that most of those power patterns exist because of the enclosable carriers. When you have a different way to coordinate, where you don't have those same convergence points that power can grab, you can grab power, then you enable us to actually, it's not just a bypass, it's actually a weaving of new capacities. How do we practice embodying new capacities when every structure that we have is subject to those powers? We need both, right? We actually have to be able to have new ways of practice. All right.
Why Holochain complete?
Good enough? Everybody. So he checked on unenclosable carrier. What about social DNA? Where are we on?
You can check that.
Okay. Cool. So brief context for where Holochain is in the history of this project. Some people mentioned they've been following some of this work for many years. And so this comes out of a project called the Metacurrency Project, which is about transcending our current one-dimensional flat models of wealth and value into much deeper things that include things that we don't normally think of as currency because we've conflated money and currency. And so we're trying to reclaim the word currency from its roots, from the Latin roots, currere, to run or flow. So think of it as a mnemonic for remembering. If you hear me use the word currency, it means current see, right? It's actually the ability to see flows, the symbol systems that we create to shape, enable, and measure flows. Money shapes, enable, and measures very small set of flows of exchanges of goods and services. Now that may not look to you like a small set, but when you consider that doesn't tell you anything about trust or love or sharing or commitment or relationship or knowledge, or like, it doesn't tell you any of those things. There's a massive realm of stuff that money does not measure. It does not, those things don't register on money at all. And yet, they register with different currencies. We've created different currencies for these things. So I said, knowledge, a college degree is a reputation currency that's showing you that a particular level of knowledge was attained in a particular domain of study, right? Like we create symbol systems for these things, and they are formal systems. Just like currencies, you can create value, but you can't create dollars. That's called counterfeiting, right? You can learn stuff, but you can't grant yourself a college degree, right? There's rules about how these things are issued and who can issue them and that kind of stuff. It's the same, I mean, there's all over the place. We use scores of currencies a day without thinking of them as currencies. And so back to the social DNA aspect of things, that's where this concept comes from, is that we can hack ourselves with these currencies because it creates feedback loop and changes behaviors of flows and of power and control and that kind of stuff when you change those patterns. So the Metacurrency project, we had a fairly simple goal of what we called at the time like open data, open transport, open transaction, and open identity, I think. The basic gist was you and I, any two people, should be able to do a transaction without being subject to any third party not of their choosing. Sounds simple. You know, so you have projects like PayPal that are marketed as peer-to-peer payment systems, right? So that's like, oh, I can pay you, I have an email address, you have an email address, we can pay each other. Except that there's like 12 levels of centralization in there. You need an email address, which means there's a mail server that somebody controls, and most people don't control their own mail servers, right? That's one point of enclosure. An email address is not a domain name, right? Domain names are actually a global namespace that is subject to enclosure and that kind of stuff. There's delegation about registry, but they're still all under ICANN, and anyway, we can go on and on. There's all these levels of enclosure for us to send that transaction. I have to connect to the internet, which means that I need an IP address. That's another global address space. I have to get access via a semi-monopoly of ISP providers. That's another third party I don't have much choice about, right? There's all of these layers, and then we go to PayPal's centralized website and use a centrally controlled currency of dollars, and like central, right? So all of these places of power convergence and capture in order for us to do this. So what came out of our work, the Metacurrency project has released different iterations of software. Some of it's being used at OpenMoney, openmoney.info I think is their site. We made something called the flow place, where we started expanding the definition of currency to many different kinds of flow tracking systems, but it was still pretty remedial in terms of its capacity to make these things interoperate or be decentralized. So then we started building something called Scepter, which we're not going to talk about much because it's crazy and weird and requires you to like bend your brains in painful ways. But if you like bending your brains, come, we'll go out tonight afterwards and we can talk about that. But the basic gist is that it's based on the receptive capacity. You could say that it's a whole rewrite of the computing stack in the form of the feminine instead of the masculine. We didn't really mean for it to be that exactly. That's not what we set out for it to be. It just turns out that that works, that actually makes things not brittle. It makes things resilient and receptive, which is where the word scepter comes from. It's the Latin to catch, right? It's to receive is to catch again, but we don't have that same root just as sieve. So we took one little part of Scepter, which had to do with multi-instance receptors and non-locality of information. We took one little part of Scepter and made a standalone version to compete with blockchain. That's what we call Holochain. So that I'm just trying to give you the context for where Holochain came from. Holochain is one piece of a much larger architecture which has self-describing protocols and semantic semantic memory, semantic trees as a native form of memory, and a whole bunch of weird stuff. But we saw tomorrow night, we're going to close the normal part of the hackathon a little bit early. Actually, we're not going to close it. You can still keep hacking if you want, but we're going to convene a session on currency design, because I know some people are coming because they want to be able to talk deeper about that. So tomorrow night, before the end of the evening, we're going to convene about currency design. And I think you'll start to see, so we have these models in the Metacurrency project about deep wealth. Not going to bring that up, thank you. Part of what we're seeing about blockchain is that it's extremely destructive. And I don't just mean the energy use. I don't just mean that it's currently using 0.5% of the planet's energy for mining. You know, like that's a lot of energy for how small a portion of the real wealth and value flows that it's connected to. That's its own problem. The deeper problem is that blockchain really has one killer app, if we tell the truth about it. And most people aren't talking about it this way, but from our vantage point, blockchain's killer app is tokenization, right? It turns the world into gambling chips. And you know, there were dreams, there were aspirations around blockchain, and still are, that I think are really good. But like when Ethereum came out and was talking about being the world's computer, and we could run decentralized apps and organize in new ways and be, you know, not subject to government control or, you know, any of these kinds of things. Like that's a bunch of the ideas of that sort of unenclosability that we were talking about. But the thing is, those dreams, like who remembers things like Lazuz, the sort of distributed, oh, we have somebody in the back who remembers. Yeah. Oh, are you with Matan? Yes. Okay, yeah. So there's like the whole idea of, well, we'll build a distributed Uber that can be driver owned and, you know, that kind of thing, except that when it comes down to it, you can't actually afford the weights, you know, the delays or the processing costs of running this on blockchain. And so what these projects have largely devolved into is, well, we'll make a driver coin so we can do an ICO and raise a bunch of money to build a centralized system that repeats the same patterns that we were trying to get out of. And, you know, like, and so we've kind of fallen short of the target, and what we're trying to do is a reset on that. And so we're looking at tokenization, this process of turning the world into gambling chips. Like, that isn't going to solve most of our deeper problems. That's actually where a lot of our problems have come from, is that we have taken all the real natural embedded value, natural resources, human resources, social things, you know, and then we convert them to numbers in a balance sheet and in a bank account. You know, these apps, we've tokenized them, and that isn't really helping the state of affairs much in terms of, it's actually the source of a bunch of our problems. So we specifically spun off Holochain to plot an intercept course with blockchain to try to aikido all of that enthusiasm, energy, resources, attention onto a more sustainable track. Overview? All right. Should we pause, ask any questions about that? Yeah, Tommy.
So a lot of that sounds kind of like these strongman generalizations, especially that you're gambling.
Do you have the other mic?
Or, you know, that blockchain has this one use case to come out of it. But I mean, if you look at all the applications provided for examples that Holochain solves, you could argue that there's a comparable equivalent on the Ethereum blockchain. You have a decentralized Twitter called Keep It. You know, you have Wikipedias that are all very successful. So, can you speak towards that a little bit? Like, maybe you're not being fair to the other side, or?
Yeah. So he didn't have the mic at the beginning. So part of the question is, are these sort of an oversimplification or straw man argument to undermine blockchain. I'm not really interested in the kind of like undermining blockchain. It does sometimes come out in my speaking, so I apologize for that. But if you look at like the distributed Twitter apps and that kind of stuff, I mean, it's like, sure, you can pay 78 cents a tweet if you want, you know, or you could run it for free on a tiny, tiny little bit of infrastructure. And then we have the scaling issue. You know, Twitter has 330 million active users, and they tweet an average of 1.1 tweets a day. When CryptoKitties reached 2,200 users, like it brought Ethereum to a crawl, you know, like, and Ethereum's currently having challenges even with the processing load right now of distributed, you know, exchanges that are running on Ethereum. And if you think about the complexity of computation in an exchange, it's pretty simple. It's like, it's not doing Pong, for example, right? Like, so there are some significant limitations, and I know that the blockchain community is hopeful about overcoming them, but meanwhile, where we actually are in the process is rather straitjacketed in a bunch of ways.
Which we'll get into in a lot more depth.
Yeah, we have a
Coming.
holochain versus blockchain sort of thing. Yep. Was that good enough for the moment, Tommy? Or okay.
Any other burners?
Burn-
Burning questions? Imagine there's a few burners in here also.
I was just going to point out, I don't even think we need to look at blockchain versus holochain from a social perspective. I mean, the blockchain's just not efficient. So economically, even old style economically, it will, you know, it's going to die off. So, but something like holochain has huge potential because it's very, very efficient, right? So, you know, I don't think you need to muddy the waters there. You can just say, you know, the blockchain is a fad that's not efficient. Something more efficient is going to come along. I think it already is. And it just takes time for the fad to fade, you know, that part of it to fade.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that it's possible that blockchain evolves, but structurally, fundamentally, if it stays with having a blockchain, it won't be as efficient as a whole.
Right, it's the proof of work that's inefficient.
Yeah.
So as long as there's a proof of work required, it's not going to succeed.
yeah, Bernie?
I just want to add a quick meta point to this. So a little bit outside the context right now, but my spirit animal that I've taken on for the last month and a half is the beaver. And we always talk about efficiency in our society, and I think that's one of the fundamental cruxes of the old paradigm. We keep talking about it needs to be more efficient, more efficient, more efficient. But the truth is, a beaver, when it dams a lake, or it dams and creates a lake, it actually creates a more habitable environment for the people around. So I feel like efficiency really shouldn't be the bottom line, just like how much money something makes should be the bottom line. I just wanted to presence that because it feels very prevalent in our culture.
If we go into this conversation, I want to do it collectively, intentionally, unless, because I feel like we're going to get into this more this weekend, and I want to make sure that we get through some of the overview stuff tonight, and then into like download it, because there'll be a lot of this over the weekend.
The philosophical conversation certainly has a gravity to it to pull in, but if we're going to get to the place where we can talk about how do we build things, we probably have to cut that a little short.
Is that a question? Do you have still a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, like, so like the apps are distributed, right? So you have like a Twitter clone. Would that mean that like, whereas Twitter would have a server with like all the tweets on it, would you have to be running like have all the tweets on every single machine? And wouldn't that be like a little bit inefficient in like space storage?
That would be terribly inefficient, and that's why blockchains which haven't figured out sharding, and there's a couple that may have or are in the process, yeah, I mean, like the Ethereum blockchain is well over a terabyte now. Does anybody know? Is anybody running? It's like 1.4 terabytes or something like that. And yeah, exactly. So in that type of scenario, that's really inefficient. In Holochain, we not only is every Holochain its own app, which is where we get into each app, distinct Holochain, design principle type stuff, and also the DHT, I may not have it here, but the The DHT is sharded, so you can break it up. It actually can become more efficient the more users you have instead of less efficient the more users you have. Mickey. These are questions from online. Crap.
So a question from our live streaming audience is, I want to ask Arthur if he thinks the incentivization of all these gambling tokens are necessary to kickstart true adoption of P2P and decentralized networks. The only successful ones before was torrenting, and people did it to save money. That was the whole question. Thanks.
There's too many layers to answer that question on. First, I want to just give one simple part. Like, yes, you need to pay people to run blockchain because it's really inefficient. So you actually have to pay people because it takes, especially since they started off with proof of work, it takes massive amounts of computing power and electricity and that kind of stuff, and you have to create incentives to run it. But I don't think it's kind of like Dropbox. You know, Dropbox doesn't pay you to hold a copy of your own files. You already want to own your data. You want to control your identity, right? If you can run a super lightweight app, like think about, you were talking about the distributed Twitter and the sharding, right? If you have 330 million active users, but say you you configure it so that there's 200 copies of every tweet online. You set up sharding, a resiliency factor of 200, right? So at 1.1 tweets a day, that means you're going to be storing 220 tweets a day. At the size of tweets, that accumulates to approximately 112 megabit photo in 6 months. So who takes 12 megabit photos without thinking about the storage on your phone? So I don't think you need to incent people in that same way. If you're saying in 6 months I will have accumulated as much, I will take up as much space as taking one photo, you don't have to pay them for that level of inefficiency. It's worthwhile to own my own data, to control my own identity, to, you know, like that kind of thing is my suggestion, that people are now questioning, do we want Facebook in the middle of all of this? Do we want Google in the middle of all this? Is it worth me running a lightweight app to take that back? And yes, wait, but the other thing is, it's been super valuable from one perspective. When I've been in this alternative currency space for 17 years, and the conversations that were possible 15 years ago, like when you would talk with people about an alternative currency, they just looked at you funny. Like, why are you talking with me about some kind of funny money? You know, I can't, that's not going to pay my rent. And now if you talk to somebody about an alternative currency, they're like, what's it do? Is it what, you know, like they're actually in the question, they're engaged. So from that sense, having gone straight to money as the tool that you built on a decentralized platform has certainly gained visibility. From our strategic perspective, that may have been a big mistake. You take something on that challenges the power people directly instead of like doing a nice little end around of let's build all of our communication protocols in a way that, and then all of a sudden, hey, it turns out financial transactions are just a protocol in a communication, right? And once you've actually adopted these things in a decentralized way for communications, then you can't stop them from running money. If you go straight at money, now you have every government trying to figure out how do we regulate this stuff and how do we shut these things down and how do we protect people from getting ripped off, and you know, like, so it may have opened up the door for us in some ways, but I think it's also closed down the doors in other ways. Can we move on from questions for the moment? We will come back more times. So as you can see right now, we were just having very kind of macro, philosophical, contextual conversations. We're intending to get into the technology as well, and we're going to be jumping back and forth a little bit between macro and micro conversations, because that's kind of what it takes to understand Holochain. Because when you like go into the code, it doesn't necessarily give you the context behind why things are structured that way. And that's actually all I want to say about that for the moment, because Oh no. Yeah, it's right there. All right. Holochain versus blockchain. I don't mean that in the terms of a wrestling match. I'm not trying to set up an adversarial context. But there are some fundamental differences in orientation that I think are worth recognizing and that are important to be able to even start working with this. You're going to have to break some assumptions, especially if, okay, so let me just ask, who has written software before? Okay, now keep your hands up if that software stored data someplace. And did you learn, okay, keep your hands up, sorry. Put your hand up if you learned that ideally you should have a single source of truth for that data, because synchronizing different sources of data are hellish, right? Like, have you all learned these design principles? And right, so we've got baked into a whole bunch of assumptions. Like, you don't want, you know, this person's phone number to be in this spreadsheet and in their web profile and in your CRM and in your, right? And then you go to change the phone number and it's in 10 different places and you don't know which one is the current one, and right, like, so we've learned, we create a single source of truth. We try to manage this single source of truth. And it leads us into very data-centric patterns where we don't necessarily question the veracity of data very thoroughly, because we manage the access to this, right? So who would like to log onto their bank account and change their bank balance? You know, if you could, right? So the bank, yeah, we get status bar, all right, okay. The bank has a lot of protections in place to keep you from doing that, right? The data that their accounts are in is stored not just behind digital firewalls and that kind of stuff, but in, you know, basically high security data centers with limited access and audit trails for anybody who enters and touches things and changes of data on the system and all that kind of stuff to keep you from being able to do that kind of thing. Now, what we're doing with Holochain, blockchain, these kinds of decentralized technologies is we're turning that inside out. And we're saying, actually, you can hold your own data. I can hold your data, I can hold my data. We can hold this stuff together and ensure its integrity and make sure that it's tamper-proof. And to me, that's where I feel like we've missed the boat a little bit on the power of blockchain, is that that's what blockchain is unleashing. It's separating data integrity from data access, right? You can actually have access, even be an authoritative source for your account balance, but not be able to tamper with it, right? And yeah, that clear? So that's actually a both Holochain and blockchain type of thing in terms of what it accomplishes. But the way of accomplishing it, like, who remembers as we started getting multiprocessor CPUs, you know, discovering issues of concurrency problems, right? Reentrant code, things like that, where suddenly you thought you had a truth, but then another thread comes in and changes it on you while you're doing something, you know, like, and so even this whole sort of single source of truth on one computer with multiple processor threads gets tricky, right? Like, it can, so now imagine spreading that across thousands or hundreds of thousands of nodes with massive simultaneity. Should we be still trying to create a single source of truth or relate to it that way? All right, I feel like I'm going into a little bit too much detail about this, but the point of it is, sorry, this is what I want to do. I want to talk about this. I want this will make it embodied. Okay. No, not even close. We're still in it. This is both. We just want to make it embodied. Okay, I'm looking around the room. Cynthia, can I check in with you for a second? How are you feeling right now? Like, check in with your body for a moment. Tired. Yeah. Okay. Lisa?
I'm attentive.
Attentive, alert, interested, engaged. Okay. Peter?
Very interested and engaged.
Okay. So we have a local state over here that Lisa is in, that Cynthia is in, and that Lisa is in, and that Peter's in. What's the global state of our being right now? Pardon? What? Is there really a global state? It's individual, right? There are indicators of shared stuff, right? Like we could, like this bear over here, he likes to get the indicator of like where are we collectively? But notice, it's not a collective status bar. It's still an individual status bar. It's about your local state, and then we look around and we take a survey and average across them, right? Part of what we're suggesting is there's no such thing as global state. All state is local, and all state changes are local. And part of the challenge that it's like blockchain has painted itself into a corner, and it's not unique to blockchain. All of distributed computing actually struggles with this, is that it's in fact, we frame it in terms of this Byzantine generals problem and Byzantine fault tolerance. So we're trying to have a global consensus, a global state reached, instead of have clear, unambiguous indication of local state that can be shared in a global context, but it isn't a global state. So what I mean by that is all blockchain apps, I can't quite say all, because there are a few things that are now different, but most blockchain apps to date are data-centric or token-centric, right? Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, there's a token, and there's a list of tokens, and you have to manage consensus about this list. This is the list. Data has first-order existence. We're saying data has some independent existence, right? That's what these blockchain things are saying, which means anytime we make a change to it, everybody interacting with that data has to have consensus about the change, right? So, and when multiple changes may be happening simultaneously-ish, we need to create a timeline by which to accept those changes, so you don't double spend something and that kind of thing. But in the real world, there is no absolute time either. There's no global state and there's no absolute time. Time is relative to your vantage point. And so what the energy we're doing in blockchain, whether that's proof of work or proof of stake or other kinds of consensus algorithms, is we're trying to construct a fiction of universal time, of absolute time, across simultaneous state change systems to produce a global state that probably shouldn't have been the way we approached it in the first place. But we're expanding the pattern from how we learned to program properly, of put all our data in one single source of truth, right? And now we can relate to that truth. Now we expand this across all these computers, and we're now in this challenge of updating the single source of truth. So what if there isn't a single source of truth? What if my Holochain instance of my app only records the changes I make? And Duke? It is a single point of truth for that locality, right? It is not a single point of truth for anybody else, just for me, right? And
people don't get all up in arms because we've got to speak our truth. I've got to speak my truth.
I just don't want the world changing my truth.
Exactly.
No, you get your truth. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Your
So
truth.
you assign new entries to your local chain with your private key, and as long as you are in control of that device with the chain and your private key, you're the only one able to write to it. Yes. Yes. So table that. We'll come back to that. But you change your state. Let's say you do a tweet, right? Now, let's say you install Clutter, which is our Twitter clone, right? First thing you do is you register a handle. You create a name, right? Then you follow some people. Then you post a tweet or something. It's a meow, actually. All of those changes you're only making to yourself. right? And so the level of verification needed in the shared space was basically that you're following the rules of Twitter, that your tweet was limited to this number of characters, that it was signed by you to your chain, you know, that the hashtags generated links on the anchors for those hashtags that point back to this, and that the mentions generate links to the, you know, like that kind of thing. There's a series of rules that get validated to make sure that your tweet followed the protocol that we are constructing tweets by, but we don't need a global ledger of all of the tweets, and we don't need everybody to agree. We can actually have a random sample of nodes that you can't predict agree about it, and even then, you don't have to trust those nodes because you have your own DNA. You have your own copy of the application and can validate anything at any time if you want. So now if you change this into a currency context, because most people are wondering how you do currencies this way, it makes it account-centric. You're doing double entry accounting essentially, right? So if Perry and I want to do a transaction, right, we send a message, we construct a transaction, I go down 10 credits, he goes up 2 credits. Our 2 chains are the only states that are changing. Why do we need consensus from anybody else whose state was not changing? I embody my local state, he embodies his local state and his chain. And you know what? There's no ambiguity about time sequence, because in a chain architecture, you have successive entries to my history, he has successive entries to his, and it doesn't matter where it is in time relative to anybody else's transactions, because those transactions weren't changing our states. So we don't need to construct a global absolute time as long as we always have unambiguous, immutable local time. Yes?
I just want to point out that this sounds a lot like state channels, and that's where Bitcoin, like the Lightning Network.
Yeah. There are similarities for sure, but they don't have, what they do is they go back to the main chain as the global reference. We have a DHT as a shared space, eventually consistent data store that randomizes the validation and enforces the rules and has an immune system.
You achieve this and you're offering it for 1/10,000th through cost.
Well, we
The same thing. So when it does state
for 1/10,000th of consensus, which you're
why do
trading
you
out
need it if you're not making a deal?
Well, okay.
Well, the thing is, it's not necessarily 1/10,000th the consensus. If you look at, so Ethereum, if you go look at the current unique miners, right? Do you know what that number is? The current, what they list as the current unique miners in Etherscan charts. It's actually 61 last I looked, which is like, because that's what they list as current unique miners. That may be by mining pool or something. I don't know why they're listing it that way, you know. And then you have EOS with 21 or whatever. But yes, you could say that we're having 1/10,000th the consensus, except that's not necessarily true. The Twitter app, we're saying we can have 200 nodes verify it, which is 10 times more than in EOS, but nonetheless, the data gets sharded. It doesn't have to live on one chain for all of those nodes. So, but the important thing is the difference here that I'm trying to elucidate is agent-centric versus data-centric. That if you put the data in the middle and you give it first-order existence, instead of that you say, actually who we have are agents who can produce data, agents who can assert data. In fact, I should have probably started this way. I usually do, but like, what's the temperature in the room right now? Anybody have an idea? 74 degrees or something, except, pardon? There is no spoon. No, what, do you think there's a different temperature maybe right here in front of the AC vent? Can you hear the AC blowing? What about screen? Ooh, yeah, that's pretty warm. So is the outside window. You know, like, there's not one temperature in the room. If you had one of those infrared thermometers and were taking readings, you'd get a bunch of different temperatures, right? And if you had recorded the temperature of the room because the thermostat over there on the wall said 74, you're getting one little piece of possible information. If we record a bunch of different temperatures, that's other pieces of information. Now, suppose we find out that the little thermometer that I was taking these readings with is 20% out of calibration. If we store the data in the database as if it's independent truth, first order information, not as if it was asserted by me wielding this device, right, then we've actually already broken the integrity of the data. We have no way of tracing back that data to its source. And this is what we are kind of in the habit of doing with single source truth databases. We assume that only truth can get in there, right? Because when you look at your sales figures, there's no way that any of the salespeople fudged the numbers, right? Like, we never get bad data in our databases, do we? That doesn't happen. And so, what's that? Not in your database, that's right. So we're suggesting that actually you can't have data integrity without it being connected to provenance, without being connected to who asserted it, when, and so that's the data integrity model of Holochain. Rather than saying data has first order truth, what we're saying is agents who can produce data have first order existence. All data is derived from them, from their assertions and from their state changes.
This one's real key. Agent centricity. I really get agent centricity because I don't get it very much. And it's okay wherever you are, but Daniel super gets it.
Daniel gets it in stereo.
Yeah, Daniel gets two people's getting.
Okay. Well, I feel like we've spent enough time on it that, yeah, and that was one of those design principles too, agent-centric versus data-centric, and we'll come back to design principles as we build stuff. Okay.
People need to stand up for a second.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you need to stand up.
Let's take a break.
Raise it really high if you need to stand up.
Stand up.
Just remember that you've got a human body. It has needs and abilities. They can do weird stuff if you want. Just science says that when you do this, it makes it better for listening and participating in sessions on Friday evenings. It's a scientifically proven fact. All right, we did that. Thank you so much. I knew I could count on you to nail that. All right, great. I should put that up there. What do you call that? Waggle?
So I kind of accidentally covered data integrity has two components, provenance and tamper-proofness, kind of. We didn't talk that much about the tamper-proofness except in the very high-level abstract, but I'm going to pass that on. Yeah, Tommy, you.
Okay, I was just discussing how does it prevent civil attacks if it only takes like 200 verifications? What's to prevent me from just spinning up 2,000 fake posts in close proximity to influence what is true?
Great question. It's on the board. We'll come back to it.
Great.
We pre-manufacture some questions. So really briefly, you're going to hear us talk about Holo and Holochain. You may not have noticed the difference so far. We may have made a little bit of a branding error in their too close proximity in naming because we misspeak them all the time, but I actually want to point out that this weekend is a Holochain hackathon. Holochain is a data integrity engine for peer-to-peer apps, basically. And the idea of it is you have to be running Holochain to be running a Holochain app, right? You have to run a peer. If you're running peer-to-peer Twitter, it's actually running on your phone or on your, oops, I've incorrectly typed my PIN 5 times in my pocket. So Holochain is designed to be basically a neutral carrier. It does not have a currency in it, for example. back to the incentives question, we're suggesting that it's lightweight enough. By the way, lightweight, and I know some people have an interest in Internet of Things, and like IOTA was claiming to be an Internet of Things thing. Who knows how much RAM it takes to actually sync with the IOTA Tangle? 64 gig, right? Like, not many Internet of Things devices have 64 gig of RAM. And so Holochain apps, we've run up to 100 full peers of different apps on a Raspberry Pi with 2 gig of RAM. So Holochain apps are super lightweight. And that was our previous version that was less efficient. We're actually in a refactor right now where we're doing a bunch of optimizations and probably expect potentially an order of magnitude increase on that. And so, sorry, Holochain is meant to be peer-to-peer, and each peer is really light. But if you write the next Facebook, or you write the next Twitter, or you write the next Airbnb, or Unter for your driver-owned ride-sharing, you want people to reach it who haven't installed some next-gen crypto platform, right? Who haven't installed Holochain. If you're renting rooms on Airbnb, you want grandma, when she's going on vacation, to just be able to type in a website into a web browser and not worry about installing Holochain. Thanks, sir. So Holo is a solution to that. Holo is a bridge to normal web browser users that extends virtual Holochain space on their behalf, basically. So it means that instead of the peer-to-peer application where everybody is carrying their own weight, so like Ethan was saying, do you have to store everything? No, but you have to store a piece, and you have to validate the things that come in to that piece. So everybody's sort of carrying their share. But if grandma wants to rent a room on Airbnb that's a Holochain app, she ain't carrying her share, so somebody else has to do it for her. That's what Holo gives us the capacity to do. That's why we were selling those Holo hosting devices, so that you can actually have people that say, I'm just going to run compute space to serve apps to those people, so that if you want to build the next social network, the conscious social network, and you want to reach people who aren't in the crypto world, you need to be able to bridge it to a web browser. You need to be able to bridge it to apps on the phone, which we finally actually have a version of apps running on the phone recently. So that's the difference, between Holo and Holochain. Holo actually has a currency that those hosts get paid in for bandwidth and storage and CPU. The difference clear? We have Tom.
I'm just curious how the currency in Holo actually is supporting the developers who are building apps. Where is the monetization for the developers to eventually be supported in the work we're doing?
So Tom's asking if the Holo currency, I'm rephrasing it, if the Holo currency actually supports developers and building apps. At the moment, what the Holo currency does in terms of its structure is support the people hosting apps. The people developing apps, we're not having the Holo currency magically solve the problem of having to have a business model, unfortunately. So what we are doing is we think we are increasing the odds of decreasing your cost, decreasing. We think we're going to be able to actually serve out cheaper than cloud infrastructure. Not yet. There's going to be this whole little curve, but like right now, you have cloud infrastructure at one price point. You have Ethereum running dApps at 400 million times that price. There's a lot of room in between. We promised in our ICO to be 10,000 times more efficient than Ethereum, but if you actually looked at the benchmarks that we ran, we were closer to 1 million times more efficient, but we didn't want to promise that because then we thought everybody would call us frauds, right? So very quickly, it's going to drop the price of hosting is going to drop very quickly. What I mean by that is these devices that we sold like a $99 Holoport Nano device that runs on a banana Pi, right? A very small device. We already know it can run about 100 instances of a Holochain app. They can't host a lot of different things, but you can host a bit. $99 device at 1/10,000th the price of compute power of Ethereum. If you could get it a 50% workload in the course of a day, would make about $60,000. That's not really going to happen. The market's not really going to bear that, right? Because if you can make $60,000 by buying a $99 device, everybody's going to do it. We're going to have this glut of supply, and you're going to have to be competing with each other to attract the supply, and you're going to drop the price very quickly. In fact, we already have that problem of the network is probably going to launch with an oversupply of hosting power and under demand of app need, like of app use. Because we already know that the network's going to launch with over 5,000 nodes just from the purchasing and stuff that we have going on already. The place that I'm getting to here is twofold. There's two ways that it's going to make your infrastructure cheaper. For one thing, everybody running Holochain is providing their own hosting. You don't need to worry about paying for that. It's only the people who aren't running Holochain that you're paying for the Holo side for, and we think the price of that is actually going to come down below the cost of cloud computing. In the same way that Airbnb has made traveling and staying places cheaper than staying in hotel rooms and provides more bed nights than the largest hotel chains without ever building a hotel, we think with Holo, we can do that to the hosting industry. Without ever building a data center, we can outcompete them in hosting load and price. We're counting on Holochain to do that, basically. Yeah.
Actually, two questions. One is, for the decentralization acolytes, comparing cost to Ethereum makes sense, but your competitor is AWS when it comes to computing. So have you done similar comparisons, cost comparisons?
We can't do very realistic cost comparisons on that side of the spectrum because all hosts set their own price. We don't. It's not a cartel. We don't control the cost. So we don't know for sure what the cost is going to be. But what we do know is that we are going to commoditize it with, basically commodity strength hardware. You don't need mining rigs with all these GPUs. This is just normal CPU compute, right? And so anyway, I can't. But what I was saying is that I think we are going to be able to compete with the cloud hosting companies. I think we're actually, yeah.
Yeah, the other question I think was a follow-up to what I heard over there, which is, so Holo Fuel is not being used to put food on the table of the developers that created it, so how are they going to make a living?
Well, the same way developers make a living right now. You actually have to build something that has a business model. Now, the thing, like, we are, sorry. But what we are intending to do in the early stages is incubate a bunch of projects and fund a bunch of projects with monies from the ICO, but that's not a sustainable model. We can't, but that's a way to kickstart a system that needs to be kickstarted. But then you still have the problem of, if you need to make money, then you need to charge a service fee on the Airbnb rooms, or you need to charge a service fee on the Unter drivers' fares, or they still need to have a business model if you need to make money. That we didn't wave a magic wand and make that issue go away. So Duke is asking, are you enclosed into only using Holo as payment for your app? No, but you can't but we would warn against trying to do things like credit card processing on a distributed peer network where you would be giving people API keys to, your payment gateways, or like you can't do that. Those are all centralized payment architectures. They're not designed for decentralization. So you could still, when you could run a decentralized Airbnb and then route it to, a single node where you're going to process the payment in the end or something. And the truth is that we think we're going to have certification levels for hosts, and some hosts could get financial processing certifications, HIPAA certifications, different things that you would need to do. But the chances are that's not with our hosting boxes. Those are the data centers who are saying, oh, hey, we can share, we have metal sitting here idle, and we're certified already in these things, let's just spin up Holo and get paid for taking advantage of our certification, and we get rid of the sales process for them and commodify their compute power. That's a low understanding of that.
Assert a currency, a form of currency on an economy, and exclude others, like whatever, for services.
I guess I can clarify this really quick. There's nothing on the blockchain platform. I'm just going to shout really loud at the microphone, and I just can't hear it on the screen. So there's nothing preventing. All right. So there's nothing on the Holochain platform that's actually preventing you from integrating with your favorite cryptocurrency wallets API. You can absolutely do that if you want to.
No, actually, I want to try to get to the basics of a Holochain app so that we can get to the architecture. And if you aren't coming back for the rest of the weekend, you can get a little overview of that. Mickey was giving me a time warning a little bit ago. She's giving me another 15-minute time warning. Can we jump into that? And then we can have more questions. So, whoops. So, this little diagram from the Holochain website kind of is outlining these things. If you think of the DHT, it's also a diagram of the network, right? Every node, if you're running a Holochain app, first of all, I want to just underscore that thing that we said before. Each app is a distinct Holochain. It's a distinct encrypted peer-to-peer network that only talks to those other peers. So that when you're running Twitter, unlike the Ethereum blockchain, where every dApp and every financial transaction and every smart contract are running on one blockchain, and you kind of need to do that in the proof of work model because your data integrity defense model is to do with that you need a lot of compute power on one space to prevent it from being taken over by others. But every app is its own Holochain, which makes it its own peer-to-peer encrypted network that is only talking to the other peers running Twitter or running Slack. Is that clear? Because the data integrity model isn't about, it's not subject to a 51% attack. And we'll get to the Sybil attack thing. But actually the short thing about the Sybil is that it depends on the validation rules you set up for your user ID for your app. Right? So for Twitter, you may have very little validation requirement to create a Twitter account. Twitter just cleaned up like millions of bogus accounts just recently. Did people see that? Right, where there was like spammers doing stuff. And so maybe there should have been a higher Sybil threshold on Twitter. But let's just take this as an example of, we could start out potentially with a low threshold. In a currency, you may want to have a higher threshold. In your Slack team, that's just for people in your company or whatever, they may need to have an invitation code to be able to validate this entry to the chain to be able to join. You get to set whatever threshold you want. You can make people sign away their firstborn child, or you can, whatever, have them stake something. You can use proof of work or proof of stake for being able to join, but you don't have to necessarily use that for every action. And we'll get to why in a moment that if you have a little bit of membrane around your app, that goes a long way. So this is the distributed, DHT. Did I say that's a distributed hash table? So backing up for a second, a cryptographic hash is kind of critical in this whole picture. Cryptographic hash is kind of like a data fingerprint. If you run the same data through the hashing algorithm, you always get the same fingerprint. You make one small change, you get a totally different fingerprint. You take this 700-page book, you take out a comma in the sentence, and suddenly the fingerprint is totally different. It doesn't. So it's a good way of uniquely identifying data, ideally low collision, all that kind of stuff. That's what a hash is. A hash table is a way of creating a lookup system for data based on its fingerprint. So you have a key value store where the key is the fingerprint and you retrieve back the 700-page book, right? A distributed hash table is a way of splitting that up across many different peers so that you don't all have to hold the same thing. And so you can shard that. And by the way, DHTs are a more mature technology than blockchain in that they predate it significantly, and there's a whole lot of different DHT models and architectures and routing systems and sharding approaches. So that we've already figured out how to shard DHTs in various ways so that you don't have to do that. Everybody doesn't have to hold the same thing. Yeah. So this is your local hash chain. Back to the word hash again, right? What we do is, in this case, we take the application code. Don't put the application one done yet. You take the application code. That's actually the first entry of everybody's chain in Twitter or in Slack or whatever. And that hashes to the same key, which is used as part of the salt, sorry, technical language, in the encryption in the network, which is part of how you know that only those peers are talking to each other. But it also means that we can verify that everybody is following the same rules. Because if you were to change a single character in the code, it would hash to something completely different, and you'd no longer be on the same network. So what this is like making sure that everybody's playing by the same rules. Now, Holochain is open source. Could you hack your Holochain node to act like it was one thing while doing another thing? Sure, you could do that up until the point that you then publish data to the DHT that doesn't follow the rules, and all the other nodes can see that you're cheating, and they can blacklist you, and you're basically dropped. Your packets start getting dropped from the network. So there's an immune system thing, just like we talked about with the cells, right? That's the mutual validation part, yep. So a hash chain, what it does is it hashes this first entry. We have a hash of pointing back to the entry that came in, and a hash to the previous entry, which in this case is null because it's the first entry in the chain. And then what you do to build a hash chain is you create another entry and you hash those things together to here, and you hash those things together. And the reason that this matters is that once you've shared that hash in a visible way, like some of the things that happened in different blockchains and stuff early on, is there are actually some blockchain approaches that are really just kind of accumulative hash chains. If you publish that hash somewhere, like some have actually published it in newspapers and that kind of stuff, publish it to the Wall Street Journal or whatever, you can't go back and alter anything in the past without breaking all the hashes moving forward. So the fact that you have a shared space that others validate and sign is part of what makes your local chain, even though you control it, immutable. Because if you were to go back and change anything, everybody can see that you just broke the data integrity. Is that part clear about the hash chain and why it becomes immutable even though it's under your control? Awesome. So, yep, and then we have the sharding here, which is storing your portion of other people's entries, basically, that you have to validate. So I don't know how much further to go into. What we end up with is essentially two immutable data stores that are immutable for different reasons. This one is immutable because it's been published to the shared space. This one is monotonic. You can only add data. You can't take data out. So when you want to delete something, if you wrote a tweet and you want to retract it, you basically can send a retract command, a delete type of command, but all it does is get marked as deleted. It doesn't actually go away, and there's reasons for this, because this is an eventually consistent system that is gossiping the data to each other. And if you actually create data here and then you make it go away here, and you don't know what order different nodes are going to receive these commands in, if you got the delete before you had the create, then you get the create, and now you have data that isn't supposed to be there, and you get in these terrible gossip loops. So you have to, for data consistency purposes, make it monotonic, meaning it can only change in one direction. It can only be added to, never taken away from. Pardon? Sharding. Yeah, so, but really quickly, you may wonder what you write your application in. So people may have seen like, who's used Solidity or written an app on Ethereum, or I thought there was more people who've done that. Yeah, come on, Will, you've written apps in Solidity, right? Loosely, all right, whatever. Okay, so the thing is that Holochain actually has, we take this biological metaphor a little bit seriously. So we actually have a ribosome that wraps different nuclei that can run different code for different apps. So the old version of Holochain, the Go version of Holochain, built in Go, the language Go, has a Lisp virtual machine and a JavaScript virtual machine. So you can write Holochain apps in Lisp or JavaScript. Almost all of them are written in JavaScript because it's more well-known, and because you end up having to write the front end in JavaScript anyway, and that way you can be consistent in front end and back end. And so that's the Go version. The Rust version that we're rebuilding right now, the first nucleus in the ribosome is actually WebAssembly, which runs really fast in browsers. And so we can, this is part preparation for Holo, so we can push some of the computing load actually out to the browser client, and that way you can service more requests on the Holo boxes. So the new thing is in WebAssembly, and there's a bunch of languages that compile to WebAssembly. There's C, C#, C++, variants of JavaScript, TypeScript, assembly script, which are all variants of JavaScript that are typed. Rust itself compiles to WebAssembly. Anyway, there's about 8 languages that compile to WebAssembly, and there's about 30 more compilers in process that are not really mature or stable yet. So that means you can write Holochain apps in any of those 8 or 30 languages soon, when those compilers are ready, and then we'll probably write more ribosomes. And in the old version, people have already written transpilers to the JavaScript version. So there's a Python, an OCaml, and a BuckleScript transpiler, I think. So if those are your favorite languages, you can write in those in the old version as well. So questions. Let's take questions, not the theoretical questions about blockchain or Holochain.
We've got 5 minutes before we want to download it and start running it.
Are we going to do that? So,
right? The 5 minutes till that? Oh, that's a live stream countdown. I thought it was okay, sorry, never mind. Great.
All right.
Questions?
Questions that are technical, architecture related.
And if we don't, we're going to do
this is a question about usage of applications on the Holochain. So as a user, do I download the agent to my phone? We're talking future. And then there might be some sort of a distributed app store where I can go download apps that I want to participate in on top of the agent. Like how will the apps get distributed? And what will I need in place first?
So the basic gist is that there are a couple of apps that may come built into Holochain. Right now, if you download our alpha release, it's just Clutter that comes in there, our distributed Twitter, just so that there's something that people can play with that's somewhat familiar. But the 2 apps that we may sort of build in by default are the key management app, because we personally think it's irresponsible to let people start building value in some context and not be able to control. Yeah, exactly. And because mostly humans suck at key management at this stage of our evolution. And then the other one is our working name. We have terrible names for these things. The key management app is DPKI, right? Distributed Public Key Infrastructure. And the App Store is the HCHC, the Holochain of Holochains, right? So it's a distributed app store that distributes distributed apps. Yeah. The, Mac, PC, or Linux. That's correct. The Go version. So one of the things we weren't super careful about in building that Go version was making sure that we didn't get anything in our dependency chain that couldn't compile with Go Mobile. And so we have a whole bunch of things in our dependency chain that stop us from being able to compile to mobile phones right now. We're being much more careful about that in Rust, and actually we've compiled the Rust version already to mobile and run a simple app. We don't have all the functionality in place yet, so it's a simple app, but we've confirmed that we can run apps on Android. We haven't done that on iOS yet, but it's supposed to also compile to that target. But that's a whole other problem of getting through the App Store for Apple and everything. So, Duke?
Apps on Web 2.0.
Can you experience Holo apps on Web 2.0?
Try Palm.
Well, right now, Holo isn't launched. Only Holochain is launched. Holo is still in development to be extending virtual Holochain space. That's part of the refactor that we're doing in Rust right now. So Holo isn't launched yet, and Holo is what we did the ICO for after having reached our, I don't know what that was, second or alpha release of Holochain or so.
For example, Scuttlebutt. You can either use Scuttlebutt or they can publish online Web 2.0 or just
Right.
HTTP.
Right. At the moment, you have to install Holochain and the Holochain app you want to run to use a Holochain app. There's not like a public web gateway that's just letting you try out apps. Because this is agent-centric, and you have to create your own agency, basically, create your own Holochain agent.
There's a comment in the YouTube that I think would be good to clarify. Someone says, tokens are like stock. They're specific to one dApp. To encourage decentralized investment decisions into a protocol, you need to establish a specific quote-unquote token that can only be used to support that particular protocol. Financing by a Holo foundation is nice, but it's centralized, not tied to any particular protocol's network effect. Could you clarify that for him?
Well, yeah, that's exactly why we're not saying that the sustainability model is to finance from the Holo group, right? Like that's a kickstart model to just get some mass built up. But one of the things that we're doing is, actually, where'd Fernanda go? Fernanda is helping steward a project called the Commons Engine, where we are establishing new commons for food. Like your project is one of the ones looking in here for, basically currencies backed by food, like Holo is backed by hosting, or backed by rides, or backed by housing, or backed by energy. We're actually creating a new set of those types of currencies, but they're not tokens. Right. That's a whole other conversation, is that currency works differently on Holochain, or at least we recommend that you do it differently. We recommend you do it agent-centric, account-centric, not token-centric.
It's a method for cryptographic accounting.
Exactly. It's a cryptographic accounting platform.
Thank you.
So Mickey is telling us we are ending the webcast. Anything before closing?
To the webcast thing, or to
Yeah, just like
we're not over, just that.
the webcast.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
On the internet, we hope that you really enjoyed this experience in the comfort of wherever you're watching from, especially if you're watching from an airport. And we applaud you. Get a pan of the room. Steven. Yeah, there you go. Welcome. Thank you so much. Woohoo. All right. Let's get back to some more questions. Here you go. Dermot.
Yes, so with the refactor or the rewrite to Rust, will the Holo ports run Go or Rust, or will they run both? Or